The Vael Industries account was supposed to be the best thing that had happened to Mara Voss in 3 years. That was what she told herself at 5:47 in the morning, loading the last of the print crates into the delivery van, while Chicago's February air cut through her jacket like it had a personal grievance. The materials were perfect. She had checked them 4 times. Color calibration exact, paper weight correct, every fold crisp enough to draw blood. 1,200 event programs, 40 branded display panels, and 6 custom presentation decks for the most high-profile corporate summit the city had seen this quarter. All of it produced in 72 hours because her supervisor, Derek Paulson, had accepted the contract with a deadline that any rational person would have rejected. Derek, of course, had not been the one awake until 2 a.m. recalibrating the press. Mara had. She drove with the heat broken and her coat still on, thinking about Nina. Tuition for the spring semester was due in 11 days. The Vael contract paid triple the standard rate. Derek had negotiated that much correctly, even if he'd done nothing else right. Her share of the bonus, if the delivery went cleanly, would cover the full balance with enough left over for Nina's textbooks and the grocery run Mara had been postponing for 2 weeks. That math was the only thing that mattered. Not the cold. Not the hours. Not the fact that she hadn't slept more than 4 consecutive hours in 5 days. The Aldmore Hotel rose against the gray morning like something designed to remind you of your place in the world. 40 stories of glass and steel on the magnificent mile, the kind of building where the lobby alone cost more per square foot than Mara's entire apartment. She pulled the van to the service entrance, checked in with the loading dock attendant, and began moving crates. It took 6 trips. On the 4th trip, a man in a hotel blazer stopped her and said the executive receiving room was on the 3rd floor, not the 2nd, and that she'd been stacking materials in the wrong staging area for the past 20 minutes. Mara did not argue. She moved the crates. All of them. Alone. By the time Derek arrived, 40 minutes late, smelling of the coffee he'd stopped to buy, the materials were staged correctly, inventoried, and ready for the client walkthrough. The walkthrough was scheduled for 9 a.m. in the main lobby. Mara stood 2 steps behind Derek as he guided 3 Vael Industries executives through the display panels, describing print specifications with the confidence of someone who understood them. He used the right terminology. He cited the right tolerances. He answered their questions smoothly, and when the senior executive, a woman in a charcoal blazer with the kind of posture that suggested she had never in her life been uncertain about anything, asked about the color-matching process for the branded decks, Derek said, "My team executed a 4-stage calibration process to match Vail's proprietary color codes exactly." His team. Mara looked at the floor. "Impressive turnaround for a 72-hour window," the executive said. "We pride ourselves on delivery," Derek said. Mara's jaw tightened. She was standing close enough that a single step forward would have put her in the conversation. She didn't take it. She thought about Nina's tuition. She thought about the number 11, the days remaining. She breathed. It was in that breath, that specific, deliberate, swallowed moment, that she became aware of someone watching her, not the polite, ambient awareness of being in a crowded lobby, something more focused than that. She looked up. A man stood 30 feet away near the base of the main staircase, still in the way of someone who had no reason to move. He was tall enough that the geometry of the room seemed to adjust around him, and he wore a dark coat over a charcoal suit that looked like it had been made for his particular set of shoulders. His hair was black, cut short at the sides, and his face was all sharp angles, jaw, cheekbones, the hard line of his brow. A faint scar ran beneath his left eye, pale against his skin. His eyes were on her, not on Derek, not on the display panels or the executives, on her. The color of his eyes at that distance was impossible to determine precisely, but there was something in them that made Mara feel briefly, inexplicably, that she had been seen, not observed, not assessed, but actually seen, the way you look at something you recognize without knowing why. Then one of the executives said something, and he turned, and the moment dissolved. Mara didn't know who he was. She made a note of his face the way she made notes of everything, automatically, without deciding to, and returned her attention to the floor. Derek finished the walkthrough. The executives were satisfied. He thanked them with a handshake and turned back toward Mara with the particular expression he wore when something had gone well, and he wanted her to know he was aware it had gone well. "Good work getting the staging corrected," he said, which was as close as he ever came to acknowledgement. Mara said nothing. She loaded the empty crates back into the van, returned the dock badge to the attendant, and was 40 feet from the service exit when she stopped. The 6th crate. Display panel 6, the one with the Vael wordmark foil overlay. She had pulled it from the van first and staged it first, and in the chaos of relocating everything to the correct floor, she had not seen it come back down. She went back inside. The service elevator was occupied. She took the stairs to the 3rd floor, found the staging room, and there it was. Crate 6, behind the door, exactly where she'd left it in the first relocation. She picked it up, turned to leave, and stopped. The staging room shared a thin wall, with what appeared to be a small conference annex. The door was not fully latched. Through the gap, voices carried. A woman's voice, low and precise. "The timing cannot shift. The transfer of control has to happen before the lunar cycle closes at the end of the month. If he hasn't acted by then, the window locks for another year." A man's voice, lower, less distinct. "And if she becomes a problem." A pause. Then the woman again, with the particular calm of someone who has already done the calculation. "She won't. She doesn't know enough to be a problem." Mara stood absolutely still in the staging room with crate 6 in her arms, and her pulse doing something irregular in her throat. She did not know what she had just heard. She knew, with the specific clarity of a person who had spent years reading fine print, that she had heard something she was not supposed to hear. She moved, quietly, without rushing, down the stairs and out through the service entrance, and did not exhale fully until she was back at the van. She loaded crate 6. She drove away. She told herself it was nothing. Corporate language was full of that kind of thing. Cycles, windows, transfers. It could mean anything. It probably meant a fiscal quarter. She told herself that for the entire drive back. She almost believed it. The part she couldn't explain came later. She had gone back to the hotel that afternoon to collect a signature Derek had forgotten to obtain, a standard release form that the Vael team needed before the formal event opening. Derek had texted her 3 times in 20 minutes, each message progressively less professional, and she had gone because the bonus was still 11 days away, and she was still the only person paying Nina's tuition. The lobby was different in the afternoon. The morning's controlled efficiency had given way to the particular organized chaos of an event hours from launch. Florists and lighting technicians and catering staff moving in overlapping currents. Everyone with a purpose, no one with enough room. Mara moved through it with the low-profile ease of someone who had spent years being the person who handled things quietly in the background of other people's important moments. She found the Vael event coordinator, got the signature, turned to leave. That was when she saw him again. He was standing near the far corridor with 2 other men, both in suits, both with the physical bearing of people who spent time doing something more demanding than sitting in boardrooms. He was speaking to them in a voice she couldn't hear across the lobby, and he had that same quality of absolute stillness that she'd noticed in the morning, the sense that he was only using the fraction of his attention that the conversation required, and holding the rest of himself in reserve. Then his gaze moved, and it found her across the full width of the lobby, through the moving bodies and the noise, with a directness that should have taken longer, that should have required searching, scanning, the normal mechanics of finding one specific person in a crowded room. It didn't. He found her in the same motion that most people used to look up from a phone. Mara didn't stop walking. She reached the exit, pushed through the door, and stood on the sidewalk in the February cold, telling herself that people made eye contact in hotels. It was a normal thing. It meant nothing. Behind her, back inside the lobby, she heard someone say her name. Not loudly, not urgently. Just clearly, with a precision that suggested the person saying it was not accustomed to repeating themselves. She turned. It wasn't him. It was a different man. Younger, with dark hair and an easy smile that suggested he used it often. He was holding her portfolio case, which she had apparently left at the coordinator's table. "You forgot this," he said, holding it out. "Thank you," Mara said, taking it. "Theo," he said. "I'm with the graphics team on the setup side. I was going to introduce myself this morning, but You were pretty locked into the walkthrough. Mara, she said. He fell into step beside her as she walked toward the parking structure, and he was easy to talk to in the way of someone who had practiced being easy to talk to, and he mentioned the timeline for tomorrow's setup and asked about the panel weights, and then said, almost casually, I heard the executive team wants the staging reconfigured for the afternoon session. That's why they pushed the receiving room change this morning. Mara slowed her pace slightly. She had not told Theo about the receiving room change. She had not told anyone except the dock attendant, and that had been before Derek arrived, before anyone from the graphics side had been on the floor. She looked at Theo. He was still smiling, still easy, scrolling through something on his phone. Maybe he'd heard it from the coordinator. Maybe the dock attendant had mentioned it. There were any number of ways a piece of logistical information moved through an event team. She noted it anyway, filed it in the same quiet place where she had filed the woman's voice through the conference room wall, and the color of a man's eyes in the morning lobby, and the feeling of being found across a crowded room before the search had properly begun. She said goodbye to Theo at the parking structure entrance. She sat in the van for a moment before starting the engine. 11 days. Nina's tuition. Everything else was noise. She started the van and pulled out into the gray Chicago afternoon, and did not notice the figure standing at the window of the 18th floor watching the street below, until a truck's headlights swept across the glass at precisely the wrong angle, and for 1/2 second, the reflection in the window showed eyes that burned a deep, impossible gold in the dark, before the light passed, and there was nothing there at all. The contract arrived at 7:14 in the morning. Mara was standing in the narrow kitchen of her apartment, still in yesterday's clothes, eating crackers over the sink, because she hadn't had time to go to the grocery store, and the bread had run out 2 days ago. Her phone buzzed on the counter, then buzzed again, then a third time in the particular rapid pattern that meant someone was not waiting for a response. The email was from Vael Industries' legal department. She read it twice. Then she sat down on the floor with her back against the cabinet, because her legs made that decision before she did. The contract, the one she had signed as a secondary contact, the standard vendor acknowledgement she had added her name to, without reading past the 3rd paragraph, because it was 11 p.m., and she had 3 more hours of press calibration ahead of her, contained a clause in Section 7.4 that designated the secondary signatory as operational lead and responsible party for all material deliverables. Not the company, not the primary contractor, the responsible party. The responsible party was legally bound to remain on-site and available for a mandatory 72-hour remediation window in the event of any material defect or delivery failure. A defect had been reported at 6:50 a.m. Display panel 4. A color banding error across the lower third that had somehow not appeared during any of her 4 quality checks, that had not been present when she loaded the crates, that existed now in photographs attached to the email with timestamps from 6:32 a.m., 20 minutes before the first hotel staff would have been in the staging area. Derek was not responding to calls. Derek was, based on his last text sent at 11:47 the previous night, dealing with a family situation that would keep him unavailable through the weekend. Mara sat on the kitchen floor and looked at the math. 72 hours of forced on-site availability meant she would miss the delivery run for the Hartley account on Saturday, which was the other contract currently keeping her rent current. Missing that delivery would trigger a penalty clause in her own employment agreement. The penalty would eat the Vael bonus. The Vael bonus was Nina's tuition. She got up off the floor, washed her face, changed her jacket, packed a bag. She was at the Aldmore Hotel by 8:30 a.m. The Vael Industries event coordinator was a woman named Sasha, who had the brisk efficiency of someone who had managed 3 simultaneous crises before most people finished their first coffee. She met Mara at the 3rd floor staging area, reviewed the defective panel, and confirmed with minimal ceremony that yes, the remediation clause had been triggered. Yes, Mara was required on site, and yes, a replacement panel would need to be produced and installed before the afternoon keynote. I can have the replacement printed by noon if I can access a press, Mara said. Sasha made a call. By 9 a.m. Mara had a temporary workspace in a back room off the hotel's business center and a key card that accessed the service floors. She worked. That was what she did with problems that had no immediate solution. She found the part of the problem that responded to effort, and she applied effort until the scope of the disaster shrank to something manageable. The replacement panel took 3 hours. She ran the press herself, calibrated by hand, checked the output against the Vael color codes with a spectrophotometer she had brought from the shop in her equipment bag, because she always brought it, because she had never once trusted a hotel business center's equipment calibration. The replacement panel went up at 12:43 p.m. The color match was exact. It was at 1:15 p.m., while she was documenting the remediation in writing for the legal file, that the door to the back room opened. She didn't look up immediately. She was mid-sentence. You documented the defect location, origin timestamp, and your own response time. The voice stopped her pen. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway. The man from the lobby, the man from the window reflection, standing in the doorway of a back room off the hotel business center, like he had simply followed a direction to its logical end. His coat was gone. He wore a dark suit with the jacket open, and he was looking at her documentation with the focused attention of someone who understood what they were reading. Most contractors would have filed a verbal report and waited for someone to tell them what to do next, he said. Most contractors didn't produce the original material at 2 a.m. and would like a paper trail confirming that the defect didn't originate in production, Mara said. A pause. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, an acknowledgement. Dorian Vael, he said. She set down her pen. I know who you are now. You didn't this morning. I looked you up after the contract email arrived. She held his gaze. Your legal department moves quickly. I didn't send that email, he said. The words landed cleanly, and she didn't respond to them immediately, which she could tell he noticed. The panel, he said, moving on as though he hadn't just stated something that opened a significant number of questions. Can you confirm the replacement will hold through the weekend sessions? Yes. I'd like you to verify the remaining 40 panels before the evening reception. It wasn't a request exactly. It wasn't quite an order either. It existed in the specific register of someone who was accustomed to having things done correctly and was communicating that expectation without bothering to frame it as anything other than what it was. I'm already on a 72-hour remediation hold, Mara said. I'll be here. He looked at her for a moment, with those amber eyes that were, up close, precisely as unsettling as they had been from 30 feet away. Then he left. Mara picked up her pen and finished the sentence she had been writing. Her hand was steady. She was proud of that. She found Theo at 3 p.m. in the catering staging area, eating a sandwich with the unhurried ease of someone whose name was not on a remediation contract. Rough morning, he said when he saw her face. Did you know about the clause in Section 7.4? I'm not on the vendor side. I wouldn't have seen the contract. He handed her half of his sandwich. Eat something. You look like you've been here since dawn. Since 8:30. Still, he leaned against the wall beside her. For what it's worth, I heard Vael himself asked for you specifically to handle the remediation instead of bringing in an outside vendor. That's not what they do with people they're planning to throw under a bus. Mara ate the sandwich. It was turkey, and something with too much mustard, and it was the best thing she'd tasted in 2 days. Who told you that? She asked. Theo shrugged. Event teams talk. The coordinator mentioned it to someone on the AV side and it moved around. He paused. Though I've also heard he keeps people close when he needs someone to absorb the damage from a problem he doesn't want attached to the Vael name. So, Mara looked at him. I'm not saying that's what's happening, Theo said, with the particular tone of someone who was absolutely implying that was what was happening. I'm just saying be careful. Guys like that don't notice people like us unless they need something from us. She said nothing. She handed him back the sandwich wrapper and went to inspect the remaining panels. She thought about what Dorian had said. I didn't send that email, and the complete absence of explanation that followed it. She thought about what Theo had said, and the way it had landed with such perfect timing, precisely when she was tired and unsettled enough to receive it. She thought about both things without deciding what to do with either of them. The panel inspection took 2 hours. All 39 remaining panels were within tolerance. She filed the documentation and returned her keycard to Sasha for the evening and went to find the elevator. She took the wrong one. Or rather, she took the service elevator that the keycard still opened, and it let her off on the 18th floor instead of the lobby, and she stood for a moment in the corridor getting her bearings before finding the staircase. The window at the end of the 18th floor corridor looked out over the street below. It was fully dark now, and the city lights were doing what city lights did at night, turning every reflective surface into something that played with perception. Dorian was standing at the window. He wasn't on the phone. He wasn't reviewing documents. He was simply standing there, looking down at the street, with his hands clasped behind his back, and that characteristic absolute stillness that she was beginning to recognize as something other than composure, something closer to coiled, like a mechanism under pressure that was choosing not to release. She should have turned around. She was in a service corridor on his company's booked floor, and she had no reason to be there. She didn't turn around immediately, and in the 3 seconds before she did, a truck passed on the street below, and its headlights swept upward through the window glass at a steep angle, throwing a wash of light across the reflection in the dark pane. His eyes. In the reflection, just for a moment, they weren't amber. They were gold. Deep, burning, luminous gold, the color of something lit from inside, blazing against the dark glass with an intensity that had nothing to do with streetlights or refraction or the particular way tired eyes processed artificial light at night. Then the truck passed. The reflection settled. His eyes in the glass were amber again. Ordinary, human. Mara turned and walked to the staircase. She descended all 18 floors without stopping. She pushed through the lobby exit and stood on the sidewalk in the February cold and breathed. She thought about the phrase she had heard through the conference room wall. Before the lunar cycle closes at the end of the month. She thought about gold eyes in a dark window. She thought about a man who had crossed a room toward her defect report, with the focused inevitability of someone who already knew what he would find there. She got in her car. She called Nina on the drive home, and Nina answered on the second ring, still awake, studying for an organic chemistry exam. And the sound of her sister's voice doing something as ordinary as complaining about molecular structures settled something in Mara's chest that had been unsteady since 7:14 a.m. "I'm fine," Mara said when Nina asked. "Contract ran long. I'll be on site through the weekend. Is it paying extra?" "Yes." "Good," Nina said. "You work too hard for people who don't deserve it." Mara almost said something about that. Instead, she said, "Study for your exam." She drove home through the city with the heat finally working, and the lights of Chicago sliding past the windows, and the image of gold eyes burning in dark glass sitting quietly at the back of her mind, waiting for her to decide what to do with it. She didn't decide. Not yet, but she didn't dismiss it either. The archive room was on the second floor, behind a door marked administrative use only, which meant it required a specific key card that Mara did not have. She had the remediation key card, which accessed service floors and the business center. She had the vendor pass, which got her through the loading dock and the staging area. She had spent 2 days learning the architecture of this hotel the way she learned everything, by paying attention when other people weren't. And she knew that the administrative corridor shared an access point with the service elevator landing on the second floor, and that the door to that landing was propped open every afternoon between 2 and 4 p.m., while the housekeeping carts rotated between floors. She went at 2:20 p.m. On Thursday, during the lunch session when every Vael executive was in the ballroom listening to a keynote on regional market expansion, and every hotel staff member with authority was managing the catering flow. She wasn't stealing anything. She needed documents with her own name on them. She had counted the security rotations twice before choosing this window. If anyone reviewed the corridor cameras later, they would see only a vendor representative moving between authorized zones during an active event cycle. Nothing irregular, nothing urgent. She did not believe in luck. She believed in timing. She told herself that while she slipped through the propped door and found the archive room at the end of the corridor and turned the handle, which gave without resistance because someone had failed to latch it after the morning's administrative check-in. The room was small and organized. Vertical filing racks along 3 walls, a narrow table in the center, a single overhead light that flickered once when she switched it on, and then held. She found the vendor contracts in the third rack, filed under event date. Her section was near the back. She pulled the folder. The original contract was there. She went to section 7.4 and looked at the signature block. Her name was typed. The signature above it was hers, or close enough to hers that the difference required knowing how she signed her name on paper when she was tired versus how she signed it when she was paying attention. The ink weight was slightly different. The pressure pattern across the downstroke of the V was wrong in a way she would not have noticed if she hadn't spent 2 years signing quality approval forms on press runs and developing the particular signature consistency that precision work required. The clause had been in the contract. Her signature had been placed on it after. She photographed the page, then the next 3 pages, which showed the revision timestamps embedded in the document header, a detail most people didn't know to look for, and which showed 2 separate edit sessions on a contract that should have had one. She was reaching to return the folder when she noticed the second folder behind it. Same filing tab, same event date. But the label read, Internal Logistics. Ancillary in the tab was slightly different paper stock, newer, the kind of detail that only registered if you spent time around print production and knew what paper aged differently. She opened it. It was not a contract. It was a map of Chicago. Not a standard city map. A detailed district grid with specific locations circled in red ink at what she immediately recognized as irregular intervals. Not geographic intervals, temporal ones. The circles were numbered, and beside each number was a time notation and a date. She looked at the dates. They spanned the next 3 weeks. She looked at the time notations. They aligned with something she recognized from the audio of the conference room conversation. Before the lunar cycle closes at the end of the month, the circles matched the lunar calendar. She knew this because Nina had a lunar calendar app that she used for a marine biology course and had talked about for 2 months, and Mara had absorbed the information the way she absorbed everything, without trying to. There were names in the margins, not full names, initials and what appeared to be position designations. 2 letters, a dash, a number. At the bottom of the second page, in handwriting that was smaller and more hurried than the notations above, 2 words and a date. Conclave. March. She photographed every page. 7 photographs total. She put the folder back exactly as she found it. She was at the door when footsteps sounded in the corridor outside, not the rolling shuffle of housekeeping. Sharp, direct, heading toward the archive room with the purposeful cadence of someone who knew the room was in use. Mara switched off the light, moved to the far side of the filing racks, pressed flat against the wall behind the last rack, and stopped breathing with the particular discipline of someone who had learned in childhood that stillness was its own form of protection. The door opened. A security guard. Not hotel security. The uniform was different. Darker jacket, no Aldmore badge, an earpiece with a wire that disappeared into his collar. He stood in the doorway for 4 seconds with his hand on the frame, scanning the dark room with a flashlight that moved slowly from left to right. The light passed over the rack 2 feet from Mara's face. It moved on. The guard withdrew. The door clicked shut. Mara waited 90 seconds before she moved. She took the long way back to the business center, through the kitchen corridor and out through the laundry access, and she sat in the back room with her phone face down on the table for 3 full minutes before she looked at the photographs. She looked at them in order. Contract first, then the map. The contract confirmed what she had suspected. Fraud. Targeted. Specific. That was manageable. That was something with a legal process attached to it. The map was different. She laid the pieces out the way she laid out a press registration problem. All variables present, no assumptions. Follow where the evidence leads. A map with lunar cycle positioning. Names in code. A word. Conclave. That was not a corporate term. A timeline with an endpoint. A woman's voice saying the transfer of control had to happen before the lunar cycle closed, and that same woman overseeing an event that had, according to that map, 6 marked locations in the city in the next 3 weeks, and Dorian Vael, standing at a window with eyes that burned gold in the dark. Mara set her phone down. She was not the kind of person who jumped to conclusions. She was the kind of person who ran the same press check 4 times, and still brought her own spectrophotometer. She required evidence. She had spent her life requiring it, because the alternative, trusting the version of events that other people handed you, was how her mother had accepted a lease with a penalty clause she hadn't read, and how her father had signed a loan agreement that took 12 years and most of what they had to resolve. She looked at the evidence. There was an explanation for each individual element that could be ordinary. There was no explanation that made all of them ordinary simultaneously. She sent the photographs to her personal cloud storage. Then she put her phone in her bag and went back to work. The confrontation with Dorian happened that evening, and it was not the conversation she had planned. She had planned to be professional, brief, to tell him that the remaining panel installation was complete, and the documentation was filed, and that she would be available through the weekend as required. She had planned to leave without looking at him longer than necessary, because looking at him longer than necessary was becoming a problem she didn't have room for. Instead, he found her in the service corridor outside the ballroom at 7 p.m., while the evening reception ran its first hour inside, and he fell into step beside her without invitation. And she said, "The panels are done." And he said, "I know." And something about the flatness of it opened a door she hadn't intended to open. "You said you didn't send the contract email," she said. "I didn't. Someone in your legal department did." "Yes. And you're not going to tell me who." He stopped walking. She stopped because he did, and because the alternative was continuing a conversation with his back, which seemed impractical. He looked at her with those amber eyes in the corridor light and said, "What would you do with the name if I gave it to you?" "Document it," she said. "The same thing I do with everything." Something moved in his expression. Brief, unreadable, gone before she could name it. "The contract error is being reviewed," he said. "The contract error is fraud," she said. "Section 7.4 was not in the version I signed. I have the original document's edit timestamps and a photograph of the signature block showing pressure inconsistency in the downstroke. I know the difference because I sign 400 approval forms a year, and I know how I sign my name." The corridor was very quiet. Dorian looked at her with an attention so complete that the air between them seemed to tighten, charged and deliberate, not threatening but absolute, the way certain silences were absolute, containing everything that hadn't been said yet and pressing it into the space between two people. "You went to the archives," he said. It was not an accusation. It was a calculation, spoken aloud. "I went to retrieve documents with my name on them," she said. "I am legally entitled to review any contract to which I am a named party." "What else did you find?" She held his gaze. "I found what I was looking for." He was silent for 3 seconds. 4. His jaw was tight in a way that had nothing to do with anger at her. She was beginning to understand the difference, though she couldn't have explained how she was learning to read him this quickly. "Go back to the business center," he said. "Stay in the event spaces tonight. I have a right to know why. You have my word that you're not the target of whatever is being reviewed internally. Your word," she said, "is the only thing you've offered me since I arrived, and every time you offer it, you walk away without the context that would make it useful." He looked at her for one more moment. Then he said, "Go back inside, Mara," and turned and walked toward the stairwell, with the unhurried certainty of a man who had already decided what he was going to do next, and saw no reason to announce it. She went back to the business center. She did not go through the lobby to get there. The parking structure was a shortcut. That was all it was. She had used it twice already, cutting from the service exit through the ground level of the structure to the business center's secondary entrance, and it saved 8 minutes over the lobby route, and she was tired, and her feet hurt, and 8 minutes was 8 minutes. She was halfway across the ground level when she heard them behind her. 2 men. Not running, walking with the calibrated pace of people who weren't trying to close distance quickly because they didn't need to. She knew this the way prey recognized predator, without deciding to know it, in the specific register below conscious thought, where the body processed things faster than the mind. She moved toward the elevator bank, calculated the distance to the door, calculated whether she would make it. Then something happened that she had no framework for. Dorian was there, not arriving. There, emerging from the shadow between 2 parked cars at a speed that the distance between where he must have been and where he now stood did not accommodate. He was between her and the two men before she had processed his presence, and what happened next lasted approximately 6 seconds and should not have been physically possible. He did not fight them. He stopped them. There was a distinction. His left hand caught the closer man's arm in a grip that, from where Mara stood, simply ended the man's forward motion entirely. Not struggled against, not overcome. Ended, as though the man's body had reached a wall it couldn't see. His right hand connected with the second man's shoulder, at an angle that sent him into the concrete pillar, with a force that the geometry of Dorian's position and the distance involved did not support. Both men were on the ground in the time it took Mara to take 2 steps backward. Dorian stood between her and them. His breathing was even. His suit jacket was barely displaced. She had seen it from 15 feet away with full parking structure lighting, and she had seen all of it. He turned. His eyes in the fluorescent light were amber. Normal amber. She looked at them carefully, and they were completely, unremarkably amber. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized now. That calculation, that reading of something written below the surface. He started to say something. "Don't," she said. "Not here." He closed his mouth. The two men were already moving, getting up, retreating toward the ramp exit with the speed of people who had reconsidered a decision thoroughly and completely. Dorian watched them go. Then he turned back to her, and she held his gaze, and they stood in the parking structure under fluorescent light, with all of it sitting between them. The speed, the force, the map with lunar notations, the eyes in the dark window, the phrase about the end of the month. And she didn't say any of it. She said, "I'll go back through the lobby." She walked away. Her phone buzzed in her bag 2 blocks later. Nina's contact name on the screen, the photo from last Thanksgiving. Nina laughing at something off camera with flour on her sleeve from the pie they'd burned together. Mara answered. "Someone called the university today," Nina said, without preamble. "They said they were from an HR department doing a reference check, but they asked about you, not me. About where you lived. Whether you lived alone." The cold felt different after that. "Don't tell anyone anything," Mara said. "I'll explain soon." "Mara, I promise," she said. "I'm handling it." She hung up and stood on the sidewalk outside the Aldmore Hotel, with the city moving around her and the weight of what she was carrying. The photographs in her cloud storage, the map with its lunar circles, the name Conclave written in hurried handwriting in a margin. Shifting from something abstract into something with edges, someone had made it personal. That changed the calculation entirely. She found him at midnight. Not by accident this time, by decision, which felt important to distinguish. She had gone back to her assigned workspace, sat with her phone on the table for 40 minutes, and worked through every variable she could name. The map, the contract fraud, the parking structure, the phone call to Nina's university, the eyes in the window, the speed in the dark between 2 parked cars. She had run the calculations until there was only one result left standing. Then she had picked up her phone and sent a single text to the number on the business card he had given her on day 1 of the remediation. The card she had put in her bag without reading because she hadn't needed it yet. She had written, "I need 10 minutes. Tonight." He had responded in under a minute. 18th floor, end of the corridor. He was standing when she arrived. Not at the window this time. Beside it, with his arms at his sides, and the particular stillness of someone who had been expecting this conversation and had used the time waiting for it to decide exactly how much of himself to bring to it. Mara walked to the center of the room and stopped. She did not sit. She did not soften the entry with small talk or professional framing. She had spent 26 years learning that the fastest way through a hard thing was directly through it. "The parking structure," she said. "The man you stopped with your left hand. You didn't overpower him. You arrested his momentum, completely. From a standing position with no leverage and no impact, you simply stopped a moving body." She held his gaze. "Human musculature does not do that. I know what that looks like because I have watched people try and fail to do things their bodies couldn't support for my entire working life. What I saw tonight was not in that category." Dorian said nothing. His eyes were on her with that complete, undivided attention. "The window on the first night," Mara continued. Your eyes, in the reflection. They were gold, not amber, not a lighting effect, not refraction from the street. Gold the way something is gold when it produces its own light. I dismissed it because I had no framework for it. I have been building a framework since then. She reached into her bag and set her phone on the table between them, the map photograph open on the screen. I found this in the archive room. 7 photographs total, backed up off this device before I left the second floor. She did not look at the phone. She kept her eyes on him. Circles on a lunar calendar, location markers across the city, a timeline ending at the close of this month's cycle. The word conclave with a date in March, and a conversation I heard through a conference room wall on the first day of this event. The transfer of control has to happen before the lunar cycle closes. She stopped. I am not asking you to confirm a story I invented, she said. I am telling you the conclusion I reached from evidence I collected without looking for it. You can tell me I'm wrong, but you would need to account for all of it simultaneously, and I don't think you can. The room was very quiet. Dorian looked at the photograph on the table for a long moment. Then he looked at her. You're not wrong, he said. 2 words. No drama around them. No performance of reluctance or theatrical hesitation. Just the flat, unadorned acknowledgement of a man who had assessed the situation and found deception both impractical and, in some register she couldn't fully name yet, unacceptable. There are people, he said, who are not entirely what humans understand people to be. They exist in every city, in every level of professional and social life. They operate in a structure with its own hierarchy, its own rules. That structure has remained invisible to the general population for a very long time, and a great deal of effort and resource goes into keeping it that way. The lunar calendar, Mara said. The transfer of control. That's not a corporate succession. That's a challenge to your position in that hierarchy. He was quiet for a beat. Yes. And whoever is behind it is using this event as cover. The week of activity, the location markers, the timeline. She paused. Celeste. Something hardened in his jaw. Not surprise. Confirmation. The conversation you overheard, he said. Yes. She looked at him steadily. I don't need the full architecture of your world tonight. I'm not asking for that. I'm asking whether the people who called Nina's university and asked where I live are connected to the same person who put my name on a fraudulent contract clause. Yes, he said, without hesitation. The word landed with a weight she had been bracing for. Knowing a thing and having it confirmed were different experiences, and her body registered the difference in the space between her shoulder blades. Then I have a problem, she said. And so do you. The photographs are backed up in 3 locations, she said. Deleting them from this phone changes nothing. His expression shifted. Not anger. Something that looked briefly like the beginning of respect in the specific form it took in people who did not give it easily. I'm going to ask you to sit down, he said. I'll stand. The corner of his mouth moved. He told her the rest. Not all of it. She understood that. He gave her the operational shape of it. A hierarchy with a defined leadership position. A challenge to that position that required specific timing aligned with biological cycles she had already mapped from the documents. A cousin with resources and alliances, and a plan that had been years in the building and had now extended its reach into Mara's life, because Mara had been in the wrong corridor at the wrong time and had made the mistake of being competent enough that Dorian had kept her present. She thinks keeping you on site gives her leverage, he said. Over you. He didn't answer that directly. He didn't need to. The photographs, Mara said. She doesn't know I have them. Not yet. Theo does. Dorian looked at her. I showed him the map on Wednesday, she said. Not the full set. I described what I'd found. I trusted him because he'd been present since the beginning, and he'd been helpful, and I was tired, and I made a judgment error. Her jaw was tight. He works for her. What makes you certain? I'm not certain, she said. I'm logical. He knew about the receiving room change on day 1 before anyone on the vendor side had been told. He appeared immediately after every significant moment. The lobby, the contract email, after the panel remediation. And this afternoon he came to find me specifically to plant the idea that you were keeping me here as a liability shield. She paused. That's not a colleague being friendly. That's management. Dorian was still. If she gets the photographs through Theo, Mara said, she believes she's neutralized whatever documentation exists, and she stops moving against Nina. She thinks she's won. And if she thinks she's won, she stops watching me before the gala, Mara said. And I have time to do something she hasn't planned for. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. It had a different texture. Less interrogative, more collaborative, like two people who had just realized they were reading from the same page without having agreed to. Dorian looked at her with those amber eyes in the low corridor light and said nothing for a long moment. Then, "What are you planning?" "Not yet," she said. "First, I need to know whether Theo can actually access the photographs or whether I need to give him the access myself." She gave him the access herself. It was the part of the plan she liked least. The deliberate construction of a vulnerability she controlled, which required trusting her own read of a situation with stakes she had not chosen. But the logic was clean, and she followed clean logic even when it was uncomfortable. She went to Theo the following morning with her phone in her hand, and the map photographs visible in her gallery, in the specific careless way of someone who was not thinking about what they were displaying. And she told him she was exhausted and rattled from the parking structure incident, and that she didn't know what to do with what she'd found. She let him see the photographs. She let him be reassuring. She let him be the version of himself that he had been performing since day one. She watched his eyes move to her screen with an attention that had nothing to do with concern for her. She said goodbye and went back to her workspace and sat with the hollowness of having been right about something she had wanted to be wrong about. Her phone buzzed 4 hours later. A notification from the cloud storage application. Access from an unregistered device. Location traced to a hotel IP address 2 floors above the business center. Celeste had the photographs. Or believed she did. What Celeste had was the set of images from Mara's phone gallery. The full backup, all 7 original files, the contract revision timestamps, the margin notation with conclave. March lived in 2 separate off-site locations that Theo had never seen, and Celeste had no way of knowing existed. Mara sent both backup locations to her personal email from a different account. Then she opened a new email draft, addressed to the Vael Industries Board of Directors, and began composing. She did not send it yet. She needed one more thing. She called Nina. Nina answered on the first ring, which meant she had been waiting for the call, which meant she was more worried than she had let on the night before. "I need you to do something for me," Mara said. "Okay, I need you to go stay with Aunt Rena for the weekend. Not because something is definitely wrong, because I'm removing the possibility of it." A pause. "Mara, I know. Is this about the HR call?" "I'm handling it," Mara said. "I need you somewhere that isn't your dorm room until Monday." Another pause. Longer. Then Nina said, "You're going to tell me everything on Monday." "Yes. Everything. Everything," Mara said. Nina went to Aunt Rena's. The email draft sat open on Mara's screen for the rest of the afternoon while she reviewed it in sections, the way she reviewed anything important. Not from the beginning each time, but in isolated passages, checking internal consistency, checking that every claim was supported by a piece of evidence she could produce. The contract fraud, documented, photographed, timestamps intact. The map and lunar calendar, 7 images, 2 backup locations, margin notation that connected to the overheard conversation from day 1. The location markers, cross-referenced against the city grid with dates, building a timeline of Celeste's planned movements that would mean nothing to a human corporate board, but would mean a great deal to the people on that board who were not entirely human. She added a final paragraph, direct, short, without embellishment, noting that she would be present at the gala closing event the following evening, and that she was requesting formal floor access, not as a vendor representative, but as a filing party with documentation pending review. She did not send the email. Not yet. She sent it at 11:47 p.m., 90 minutes before the gala's guest list was finalized, and access became fixed. Then she closed her laptop and looked at the wall of her workspace and breathed, slowly. In the way she breathed when a press run was loaded and calibrated and committed, and there was nothing left to do but wait for the output. She had moved first. That was what mattered. Whatever Celeste had planned for the gala, she was planning it against a version of Mara that no longer existed, the isolated vendor representative with photographs that could be confiscated. No allies, no formal standing, and no move left to make. That version had been replaced. The city outside the hotel window was still and dark and indifferent, and Mara sat in the quiet business center with her hands flat on the table and steady, absolutely steady, and thought about Nina laughing at something off camera with flour on her sleeve, and thought about 11 days that had become 2, and thought about the feeling of standing at the edge of something she had not chosen and choosing anyway. Forward, not back. She turned off the light and went to find somewhere to sleep. The gala began at 8. Mara arrived at 7:40 with her vendor badge, a USB drive in her jacket pocket containing every file she had sent to the board the night before, and the particular composure of someone who had run out of room to be afraid and had crossed over into something cleaner on the other side of it. The Aldmore's Grand Ballroom had been transformed from the functional event space she had spent 4 days servicing into something designed to communicate power without stating it directly. Black linen on every surface, candles in clusters of varying height, the Vael Industries branding present but restrained, the company's mark on the podium, and the display panels she had printed, visible but not aggressive, the way genuinely secure institutions didn't need to announce themselves. 200 guests. Corporate sector, finance, real estate. 3 people she recognized from the financial press, and layered underneath all of that. She could feel it now, in a way she hadn't been able to name on day 1. A secondary gathering. A room within the room. People who moved differently through the space, who positioned themselves with a geographic intentionality that had nothing to do with catering access or networking proximity. She had been in this building for 4 days. She had learned its architecture. She was learning this one too. She checked in at the vendor registration table without incident. Her name was on the list. Her formal floor access request had been acknowledged in a single-line reply from the board coordinator at 6 a.m. No explanation, no approval note, just her name added and confirmed. Someone on that board had read her email. She was moving toward the interior entrance when Celeste stepped in front of her. She had seen Celeste twice before at a distance. Once on the first day in the corridor through a partially closed door. Once crossing the lobby with the brisk certainty of someone who owned the air she walked through. Up close, the woman was more precisely constructed than distance had suggested. Every element of her appearance was a choice made to communicate authority, and the combination worked in the way of things that had been refined over a long time. Her silver-gray eyes found Mara with an expression that was not surprise. It was the controlled version of displeasure, the kind worn by people who had expected a problem to be resolved and had just discovered it hadn't been. "Ms. Voss," she said. "Vendor access for tonight's event concluded at 5 p.m. "I'm not here as a vendor," Mara said. "I have formal floor access as a filing party. It was confirmed this morning. I'm not aware of that confirmation." "Then you're working from incomplete information," Mara said, which may be a pattern worth examining. Celeste's expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted. A recalculation, fast and invisible. The kind that happened when someone realized the board already knew. She stepped aside. Mara walked through the entrance into the light and noise of the ballroom and did not look back. She found the position she had identified in advance, a floor-level space near the second display panel, close to the center aisle, with sightlines to the podium and to 3 of the 4 main exits. The kind of position a vendor representative might occupy to monitor the material she had installed. The kind of position from which a person could be seen by the entire room if she needed to be. She stood there, and she waited. The first hour moved the way formal events moved. Speeches she didn't listen to, catering passes, the slow reorganization of a room as alcohol and familiarity loosened the precision of arrival positioning. She watched Celeste move through the space with a fluency that told her exactly how many of these people were her people. The subtle nods, the eye contact held a fraction of a second longer than social convention required, the small adjustments in body language that said we are operating from a shared understanding. She watched Dorian. He was at the front of the room near the podium, in conversation with 2 men whose body language placed them as board members or equivalent. And he had not looked in her direction since she entered, which she understood was intentional. Whatever she did tonight, He had made clear the previous night that it would be her doing. He had not asked her to stop, had not offered to manage it for her, had not inserted himself between her and her own decision. That had told her more about him than most of the other things she had observed combined. At 9:15, a board member she recognized from the email confirmation. A man named Harrow, early 60s, whose name appeared in the organizational chart she had found in the supplementary documents, stepped to the podium for what was announced as a brief closing address. Mara moved to the center aisle. She heard Celeste's voice from somewhere behind her, sharp, low, directed at someone. Then footsteps. She spoke first. "I need to address the room," she said, loudly enough that the nearest 20 people turned immediately, and the ripple of that turning spread outward until Harrow at the podium paused mid-sentence, and the room's attention redirected with the reflexive compliance of a crowd responding to an unexpected input. She had about 45 seconds before someone official moved to remove her. She used them. "My name is Mara Voss. I am the named operational lead on the Vael Industries print contract for this event, a designation that was placed on a document without my knowledge or consent, in a fraudulent alteration that I have documented with photographic evidence, revision timestamps, and signature analysis." She kept her voice even, carrying, the voice she used when she needed to be heard across a press floor over running machinery. Those documents were submitted to this board at 11:47 last night. Every person in this room who received that email has now had 14 hours to review the evidence. She reached into her jacket pocket and held up the USB drive. This contains the complete file set, the contract alteration, the archive documents, a city map with location markers aligned to the current lunar calendar, with dates, times, and position codes that I believe are directly relevant to a challenge to the leadership structure of this organization. A challenge timed to conclude before the end of this month's cycle. The room was silent in a way that 200 people in a ballroom were almost never silent. Not the silence of confusion, the silence of comprehension. Approximately a third of the people in that room knew exactly what she was describing. She could identify them by the quality of their stillness. Celeste's voice came from behind her, controlled and precise as a blade. "This woman is a human contractor with no standing in this room and no understanding of what she is claiming to discuss." The word human landed the way it was intended to, as a diminishment, a categorical exclusion, an argument from authority that required no evidence because the hierarchy itself was the evidence. The silence that followed was different, denser. The people who understood what Celeste had just said were now looking at Mara with an attention that had shifted from curious to evaluative. Mara turned to face Celeste directly. "You're right that I'm human," she said. "I am also the only person in this room who walked into your archive, found your documents, recognized what they meant without being told, built a complete evidence file in 72 hours, distributed it to 14 board members before you knew it existed, and is standing here right now because you made the mistake of underestimating the one person who had no reason to be afraid of your hierarchy." She turned back to the room. "The map in this file includes a notation. Conclave. March. I don't know exactly what that means in the full context of your structure, but I know it appears on a document that also contains a plan to use this event as cover for a leadership transfer that your rules do not permit. I know the timeline was designed to be completed before anyone with authority to stop it could respond." She set the USB drive on the nearest table. "The evidence is there. What you do with it is your decision. I've done my part." The room held its breath for 3 seconds. Then Celeste moved, not toward Mara, toward the exit, the fast, decisive movement of someone executing a contingency. And 2 men near the side wall moved to intercept her with a coordination that confirmed they had been positioned there intentionally, which meant someone had read the email last night and had made preparations before this moment arrived. Harrow at the podium said something in a low voice to the man beside him. And then Dorian stood up. He had been seated at the front table, and he rose without urgency, without announcement, without the theatrical quality that the moment might have invited in someone who understood it less precisely. He simply stood, and the room adjusted to the fact of him standing the way it adjusted to everything about him, completely, without negotiation. He walked across the ballroom floor, not quickly, not reactively. He crossed the distance with the measured pace of someone who had already decided on this outcome before she ever spoke, who understood the weight of public declarations in a room like this, and chose the exact second to make one, not to the podium, not to where Celeste was being redirected by the two men near the wall, to Mara. He stopped beside her, not in front of her, not between her and the room, beside her, with 3 inches of space between their shoulders, facing the same direction, both of them visible to every person in the ballroom. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Mara Voss came into this building 4 days ago to deliver print materials, he said. She was handed a fraudulent contract, had her professional reputation targeted through internal channels, had her personal safety threatened, and had her family contacted as a form of pressure. In response to all of that, she documented everything, protected the evidence, distributed it through proper channels before any of you could be informed of its sensitivity, and then walked into this room and presented it herself. A pause. Without being asked, without protection, without any standing in this structure except the one she built herself out of evidence and nerve. His eyes moved across the room. Steady, Amber, with that quality of absolute authority that she was beginning to understand, was not performance. It was simply what he was. I answer for her, he said, fully, completely, without condition. In the silence that followed, Mara was aware of approximately 200 people understanding that something permanent had just occurred, that the words Dorian Vael had spoken in this room, in front of these witnesses, in this specific framing, were not corporate endorsement. They were something with a different weight, in a different structure, a declaration that could not be walked back, that existed now as a fact, as fixed as anything written in the documents on that USB drive. Celeste stopped moving. Her silver-gray eyes found Mara across the ballroom floor, and in them, beneath the controlled surface, was something that looked less like fury, and more like the moment a calculation finally resolves, and the answer is not what you expected. She was escorted out, not loudly, not with the theatrical removal of someone fighting it. She walked out between 2 members of the internal security team, with the silence of a woman who understood that her position had just been permanently and publicly erased, and that making noise about it would only extend her humiliation. The door closed. The room exhaled. Mara stood in the center of the Aldmore Hotel's grand ballroom with 200 people redistributing their attention around her, like water finding a new level. And she felt the adrenaline draining out of her in a slow, cellular withdrawal that left her hands slightly cold and her jaw slightly aching from the 40 minutes of keeping it composed. Dorian was still beside her, the board member near the exit. She said quietly, "He had people positioned before I spoke. He received your email at midnight and called an emergency session at 6 this morning." A pause. "You gave them enough time to prepare." "I timed it," she said. "I know." She looked at the USB drive still sitting on the table beside her. Someone from the board's side would collect it. It had already served its primary function the moment she held it up and described its contents to a room full of people who understood the implications. "Your word," she said, "when you said I had it. On Wednesday night, in the corridor." "Yes." "I didn't use it," she said. "I built something I didn't have to trust anyone else to hold." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I noticed." She looked at him sideways, and he was already looking at her, and the space between them had that quality again. Concentrated, deliberate, unmistakable, that she had been cataloging without meaning to since a man's amber eyes had found her across a lobby on a cold Tuesday morning with the immediate, unearned certainty of something that already knew where it was going. "I need a drink," she said. "There's an open bar," he said. "I know," she said. "I installed the display panel next to it." She walked toward it, and after a moment, she heard his footsteps behind her, unhurried and certain, following the direction she had set. The consequences arrived in layers, the way real consequences always did. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the incremental, compounding way of things that had been building pressure for a long time, and were now being allowed to release. Celeste Vael was formally removed from the Vael Industries Board within 48 hours of the gala. The internal announcement cited, conduct inconsistent with organizational governance standards, which was the kind of language that said everything to people who understood the structure and nothing to people who didn't. In the world, Mara had spent the past week accidentally stepping into. The removal meant something with a longer reach. No pack, no position in the hierarchy, no protection from the network that had made her dangerous in the first place. She had spent years building leverage inside a structure that had now closed around her absence, like a wound healing over. There was no appeal process. There was no reinstatement path. She was simply gone from the architecture, the way a load-bearing element removed too late left the rest of the structure intact and the empty space as the only evidence it had ever been there. In the human-facing world, the board filed a formal report citing financial irregularities in the ceremony office's vendor management accounts. 9 contracts, 3 of them signed in the last 6 months, all traceable to preferential access arrangements that Celeste had run through the event infrastructure. The report went to the company's external auditors on a Friday morning. By Monday, it had generated enough secondary documentation to keep 3 law firms occupied through the spring. Mara read the audit summary on her phone on Sunday morning, sitting on the floor of her apartment with coffee she had actually made in her own kitchen for the first time in a week, eating toast that had not come from a hotel catering cart. She read it twice. Then she set the phone down and sat with the particular quiet of someone who had been in motion for so long that stillness felt like a new language she was learning to speak. The tuition confirmation email had arrived that morning as well. Not just processed, not just pending, but cleared in full through the end of the semester, with a formal production credit attached to the Vael event documentation that strengthened her standing for future contracts. The 11-day countdown that had governed her decisions the week before was no longer ticking. Derek Paulson was terminated on Monday. She heard about it from Sasha, the Vael event coordinator, who sent a brief and professionally worded message informing Mara that the formal credit attribution for the event's print production had been reviewed and corrected. All materials, the programs, the display panels, the branded presentation decks, now carried the production credit she had earned. Her name, her work, on record, permanently, in the documentation of the highest-profile corporate event the company had staged in 3 years. It was a small thing. It was also not a small thing. She had spent enough years watching other people stand in front of work she had done and accept the acknowledgement for it to understand exactly what the correction weighed. She sent Sasha a reply that was 2 sentences long and professional, and then she sat with her coffee and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a long time. Longer, she suspected, than the past week. Theo was gone. Not fired, not confronted, not formally charged with anything that would leave a public record. He had cleared his workspace on Saturday morning while the gala's cleanup crew was still moving through the ballroom, and by Saturday afternoon his access credentials had been deactivated and his name had been removed from the event staff registry. Mara learned this from the same security log she had requested as part of her formal documentation filing. She had expected to feel more about it. Instead, she felt the clean, specific absence of something that had never been what it appeared to be. Not loss, but the removal of a weight she hadn't fully registered until it was gone. She had been careful about who she trusted before Theo, and she was careful after him, and the week between those 2 versions of herself had cost her sleep and certainty, and the particular comfort of believing that a person who offered help was offering help. She filed that cost where she filed everything, clearly labeled, accessible, so she could find it again if she needed it. She called Nina on Sunday afternoon. Nina answered before the second ring, which meant she had been waiting since the moment she woke up, possibly since Friday. "Start from the beginning," Nina said. So Mara did. Not every detail. There were layers of it she was still sorting through herself. Dimensions of the world she had stepped into that she hadn't fully mapped yet, and wasn't ready to narrate, but the shape of it, the contract, the documents, the gala, the evidence she had built, the email she had sent at 11:47, the USB drive on the table in a room full of people who understood exactly what she was describing. Nina was quiet for a long time after she finished. Then she said, "The HR call. The person who asked about your address. It won't happen again," Mara said. "You're sure?" "Yes." Another pause. "And the tuition?" "Paid," Mara said. "It cleared on Friday." You're covered through the end of the semester." Nina made a sound that was trying to be casual, and failing at it entirely. "I burned the organic chemistry exam." "You always say that." "This time, I mean it." "You always say that too," Mara said. She heard Nina laugh. That specific laugh, the one from Thanksgiving, the one that showed up in the photo on Mara's phone that she had looked at in a parking structure on a cold Thursday night to remember what she was doing all of this for. They talked for 40 minutes about nothing consequential, and Mara sat on her kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet and her coffee gone cold beside her, and when she finally hung up, she stayed where she was for a while, just breathing, just being somewhere small and quiet and entirely her own. Dorian found her on Monday. Not at the hotel. That chapter had closed. He came to the print shop, which she had not expected, which meant he had looked up the address, which meant he had decided to find her rather than wait for her to reappear in a context that was convenient for him. She noted this, and said nothing about it. He stood on the other side of the front counter in his dark coat, with the city's late February cold still on his shoulders, and he looked at her with those amber eyes in the flat fluorescent light of the shop. And she looked back at him from behind the counter where she had been doing the press calibration she had postponed for a week, and they regarded each other for a moment in the particular silence of two people who had been in a compressed, high-stakes situation together, and were now encountering each other in the ordinary world for the first time. He looked different here, not diminished. He was constitutionally incapable of being diminished by a context, but grounded differently, stripped of the hotel's architecture and the event's formal register, standing in a print shop next to a rack of paper samples and a sign about turnaround times. "I have questions," she said. "I expected you would. Not the kind you can answer in 10 minutes. "I know." He held her gaze. "I'm not here to answer them in 10 minutes. She set down the calibration tool. She came around the counter and stopped 4 feet away from him, which was close enough to see the faint scar under his left eye clearly, and to notice that in this light, his eyes were exactly the same amber they always were, and that she now understood the gold she had seen in the window was not a trick of the light, but another version of the same eyes, a version that existed in a different state, under different conditions. That understanding sat in her chest like a door that had been opened and could not be closed, not because it was frightening, but because it simply was, and she was not a person who closed doors on true things. "What you are," she said. "What your world is. What the hierarchy means. The conclave in March." She paused. "I want to understand it. Not the version that protects me from it. The actual version." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's not a short conversation," he said. "I know. I have time." Something moved in his expression. Not the restrained, not quite smile she had been cataloging all week, but something fuller than that. Something that surfaced and stayed, and it changed the geometry of his face in a way that made him look, briefly, like a person who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and had just set it down. "There's a place near the river," he said. "Good coffee, no event staff. I need 20 minutes to close up the shop." "I'll wait." He did. She found him outside when she emerged, standing on the sidewalk with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the street with the easy, absolute patience of someone who had decided this was where he was going to be, and had no interest in being anywhere else. They walked to the river. She asked her questions and he answered them. Not all of them. There were layers that required more time and more trust than a Monday afternoon could accommodate, but he answered the real ones, the structural ones. The ones that had been sitting in her chest since a conference room wall had let the wrong conversation through. She listened the way she listened to everything important, without interrupting, without performing comprehension she hadn't reached yet, without softening her reactions to make the speaker comfortable. She asked about the conclave in March. He told her what it was. A formal assembly of the hierarchy's senior structure, convened at the end of every multi-year cycle to address challenges, transitions, and standing decisions. He told her what Celeste's plan had been intended to accomplish, before the conclave made any formal leadership challenge significantly harder to execute. She asked if Celeste had acted alone. He paused. It was a specific pause, the kind that preceded an answer that was going to be true but incomplete. In the execution, yes, he said. The planning was hers. The resources were hers. But there are people in the senior structure who would have benefited from the outcome, he said, who may have known, in general terms, what was being arranged, who chose not to ask questions they didn't want answered. That's not the same as acting alone, she said. No, he said. It isn't. They were standing at the river's edge. The water was the particular gray-brown of February in Chicago, moving with the slow, indifferent permanence of water that had been here before the city and would be here after it. The wind off the river was sharp, and Mara had her coat buttoned to the collar and her hands in her pockets, and she was warm enough. The conclave is in March, she said. 5 weeks. And the people who chose not to ask questions will be there. Yes. She looked at the water. Then you have 5 weeks to figure out which ones they are. He looked at her sideways. We. She turned to look at him. You read an organizational chart in a hotel archive and mapped a lunar calendar against a city grid in a back room off the business center, he said. In 72 hours, without any context for the structure you were analyzing. He paused. I'd be considerably less intelligent than I need to be in my position to not want you working on that problem. Mara looked back at the river. She thought about the document. The map. The circles in red ink aligned to phases of the moon. The notation in hurried handwriting in a margin that had started everything she now knew. I'm not part of your hierarchy, she said. No, he said. Which means I can look at it without being inside it, she said. Without the assumptions you all carry about each other. Yes, he said. She thought about that. Good coffee? She said. Excellent coffee. Then we start there. She left the river at 4 in the afternoon and walked back to the shop alone, the long way, through streets she knew by the particular language of daily familiarity, the bakery on Winthrop that always smelled like cardamom on Mondays, the broken traffic light on Berwyn that had been broken for 8 months, the stretch of Ashland where the wind always hit differently because of the gap between 2 buildings that funneled it off the lake, her city, her ordinary city, in its ordinary Monday state, going about its ordinary business. She walked through it and knew, in the specific way she knew things that had been confirmed rather than discovered, that it was not entirely what she had always understood it to be, that somewhere in the same streets, the same buildings, the same professional and social infrastructure she had moved through for 26 years, there was a parallel structure operating with its own rules and timelines and hierarchies, older than the city itself, hidden so thoroughly that it had never once surfaced in any form she had recognized until a conference room wall failed to latch properly on a Tuesday morning in February. She was turning her keys in the shop's lock when her phone buzzed. She checked it. Unknown number. No contact name. A single message, 7 words and a date, with no preamble or explanation. Celeste didn't plan this alone. Ask Dorian about what the conclave in March is actually deciding, and who requested it be called early. She stood on the sidewalk with her keys in one hand and her phone in the other, and read it twice, and looked up at the street. The traffic moved. The wind came off the lake. Somewhere above the city, the clouds were the particular flat gray of late February, unremarkable, identical to every other late February sky she had ever stood under. She looked at the message again. Who requested it be called early? She put her phone in her pocket, unlocked the shop, turned on the lights in the press, and sat down at her workstation and opened a new document and began, in the clean, precise way she did all things that required attention, to write down everything she knew. It was going to be a longer list than she had started with.